Many in the international community today believe that the West Bank is illegally occupied by the State of Israel. In this 7-part series, we examine this assumption and will determine what international law has to say about it. In addition to relying on relevant legal precedents, treaties, and customary international law, beginning with the formative historic events of the early 20th century, our analysis is based on the authoritative legal treaties on the subject, The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law by legal scholar Howard Grief. In part 2 of this video series, we discussed the most important legal and political events that affected Palestine during the Mandate period. Now, in part 3, we will briefly discuss the most important legal and political events that affected Palestine after the Mandate period. We will discuss the attempt by the United Nations to divide Palestine even further to create another Arab state, this time west of the Jordan River, the results of the War of Independence and the Six-Day War, and the importance of the legal principle known as acquired legal rights, and its ramifications regarding Israel's sovereign right and legal title to the land of Israel, i.e. Palestine. Shortly before British rule during the Mandate period came to an end, on November the 29th, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181, recommending, not mandating or forcing, but recommending that Western Palestine be divided even further, essentially attempting to create separate Arab and Jewish states west of the Jordan River. However, the General Assembly did not then and does not now have jurisdiction under the United Nations Charter to change the legal status of Palestine. Why not? Because such an action would violate international law. It would violate, for example, the League of Nations Covenant, the San Remo Resolution, the Mandate for Palestine, the Franco-British Boundary Convention, the Anglo-American Convention, and the UN Charter itself. And even if Resolution 181 did not violate all of these treaties of international law, it still wouldn't be legally binding. Why not? Because the UN does not have the authority to create or diminish national sovereignty. It's as simple as that. For example, do you think that by a General Assembly resolution the UN can impose its will on, say, Canada, to demand that a portion of Canada's sovereign territory be lopped off and given to another nation, or used to create a new nation? Of course not. Such an idea is totally preposterous. Likewise, the UN did not then and doesn't now have the authority to do this with Palestine either. But we'll go even further. Even if Resolution 181 did not violate all of the treaties of international law we just referred to, and even if the UN General Assembly had the authority to create or nullify national sovereignty, there's actually a third reason why Resolution 181 has no further legal significance. Although it was initially accepted by the Jewish Agency out of duress, it was totally rejected by the Arabs through their coordinated act of war against the Jewish state. And in law, any contract agreed to by only one party, it's not legally binding. And further, force majeure, which is another common legal concept in contract law, frees a party from liability or obligation when extraordinary events or circumstances beyond its control take place. And since war is considered force majeure, even the sole party that initially agreed to the recommendation, that's the Jewish people, are not bound to their original acceptance of the resolution. Now, understanding all these principles, David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, considered Resolution 181 a dead letter when he annexed land that the Israel Defense Forces had taken control of during the War of Independence, an action essentially undisputed by the nations of the world. What we see here are three maps. The one on the left represents the portion of Palestine that remained under British rule at the end of the Mandate. The middle one represents the proposed partitioning of that remaining portion by Resolution 181. And the one on the right represents the borders of the State of Israel at the end of the War of Independence. It's important to keep in mind that although we frequently see a map like the one in the middle, those borders never actually existed, and they were never mutually agreed upon by anybody. So contrary to the often spoken rhetoric, Israel didn't gain territory as a result of the War of Independence. It just didn't lose as much as it would have lost had the Arabs accepted the resolution and had they not attacked the Jews. The borders of Palestine, as laid out in the founding legal documents discussed in the first two videos, that should be the frame of reference, not UN Resolution 181. And so the question is, what happened to the legal framework for the existence of the Jewish state of Palestine after the War of Independence, considering the fact that the Jewish state was not in control of all of its national home by the end of the war? The answer is nothing. That's right, nothing. The legal framework remained completely intact. The scope of Jewish legal rights was not limited to the part of Palestine that became the state of Israel. All that happened was that the state of Israel did not have control over portions of the Jewish national home that it was entitled to under international law. Nations that recognized Jewish legal rights when the mandate was confirmed were just as bound after it ended. And that means that the countries that attacked Israel were all in violation of international law when they attempted to destroy the nation that actually held legal title of sovereignty to Palestine. Egypt and Iraq both affirmed the San Remo Resolution when they approved the Covenant of the League of Nations and joined the League of Nations. And Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria did the same when they joined the United Nations. And the so-called Green Line that we hear so much about in the news was not an international recognized border. It was just an armistice line. That's it. And further, Jordan, which, keep in mind, is an illegitimate nation that came into existence by the illegal actions of the Hashemite family and the British government, never gained valid legal rights and title of sovereignty over Judea, Samaria, and eastern portions of Jerusalem, what they called the West Bank. Why not? Because Jordan violated international law in attacking Israel in the first place. And Egypt never had legal sovereignty over Gaza, even though it actually never claimed it had legal sovereignty, but for the same reason. And Syria never had legal sovereignty either over the Golan Heights, again for the same reason. And all of this just demonstrates one important principle. A right does not arise from a wrong. Let us now jump ahead to 1967 and the Six-Day War. As a result of the Six-Day War, Israel came into possession of many areas of the Jewish national home. The Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And the question here is, did Jewish legal rights and title of sovereignty to all of Palestine remain intact after May 15, 1948, when British rule under the Mandate ended? For the 19 years that those areas were occupied by Jordan, by Egypt, and by Syria? Article 70 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties declares a very important principle of existing international law. Unless the treaty otherwise provides or the parties otherwise agree, the termination of a treaty under its provisions, or in accordance with the present convention, does not affect any right, obligation, or legal situation of the parties created through the execution of the treaty prior to its termination. To put this into perspective, it means something very simple, that regardless of the war of aggression against the fledgling Jewish state and the subsequent occupation of parts of the national Jewish home by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, the sovereign rights of the Jewish people over all of Palestine, including the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Transjordan, Jerusalem, and so on, including the right to settle anywhere within Palestine, that's the land of Israel, without discrimination. None of those rights were terminated when British rule came to an end in May 1948. But the question lingers. Did the parties agree to terminate the rights of the Jewish people in the armistice agreements made between Israel and Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan? The answer to that question is an unequivocal no. The parties did not agree to terminate the sovereign rights of the Jewish people to any of its homeland. So the Jewish people preserved their legal rights and title of sovereignty in the armistice agreements that Israel signed with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon in 1949. And among the international community, nearly every single country in the world, including all of the Arab states, did not even recognize Jordan's 1948 to 1967 illegitimate, illegal occupation of Jerusalem, Judea, or Samaria anyway. And to top it off even more, in 1988, King Hussein of Jordan publicly severed all legal and administrative ties that Jordan had with what he called the West Bank. So from the point of view of international law, all Jewish legal rights and title of sovereignty from the San Remo Resolution of 1920 remained intact even after the armistice agreements were signed after the War of Independence. And therefore, when the State of Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, Golan Heights, and the Holy City of Jerusalem in 1967, it was merely taking control of territory that it was already legally entitled to under international law in the first place. In part 4 of this video series, we will examine the meaning of the term Palestinian and answer the question, who are the Palestinian people?